that we're paying tribute this afternoon, as is really the whole nation, to Advocate George Bizos, passing away late last night at the age of 92. A man who spent his life fighting for justice in the courtroom. Let's speak now to the South African Communist Party, and their first Deputy General Secretary is Mapaila. Mr. Mapaila, good afternoon to you. What are your thoughts this afternoon about the role and the contribution that George Bizos made?
Good afternoon, Stephen. To our viewers, I would must indicate our sincere and profound condolences to the family of Comrade George Bizos. And he was a high-flying legal idiot and a human rights lawyer who represented many of our comrades across the movement who were fighting against apartheid. We really feel sad that he has left us and he has taken with him that great mind. Indeed, George Bizos was a revolutionary who helped to dismantle apartheid system through not only representing its opponents, like my majority of whom were our members in the liberation movement, but he challenged the apartheid framework legally and frontally through his commitment to human rights perspective. And I think that remains one of the major tributes we can pay to him for his humanism. And of course, he was a pillar of non-racialism in this country. He risked his own life and that of his family when he was confronting the apartheid regime, and in such a way that they always harassed him constantly, and he never wavered. And throughout many decades of his practice, he confronted the injustices of the apartheid system, and for that we always remain grateful for his contribution to our liberation struggle. Indeed, George Bizos was a revolutionary.
He was someone who fought for justice and human rights his entire life, first against apartheid, and even, you know, where he felt that he needed to get involved after apartheid, the Marikana miners, for example.
Yes, he always stood for justice. He didn't care what system was in place, whether democracy, because democratic government can also be stolen by demagogues and people that do not believe in the protection of human rights, as we can see worldwide, where the seat of government is just being used to oppress people instead of completely freeing them from many sorts of injustices. That is why George Bizos, as a human rights activist and a legal person, always used the law and the legality and the equality of all human beings as a platform to expose even the injustices committed even by democratic governments on ordinary people. And that will always remain grateful. We hope that many of our lawyers can learn from him and continue the struggle where he has left off to ensure that there's justice for the majority of the working people.
I was going to ask you about that. I mean, a lawyer with the size of the legal brain that he had and the experience that he had could easily have had the world's nicest office in the Sandton skyline somewhere, but he did things very, very differently.
Yes, I think Babu George Bizos, the main thing is that just his general demeanor to people. He didn't care your status. He had such a nice demeanor to ordinary people. You could go and talk to him about many other things and so forth. And of course, you know, I remember one time he was representing us at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Pretoria on the matter of Comrade Chris Hani. When we were really discussing the legal questions, some other people came to ask him about normal things. And, you know, he made a nice excuse to attend to them and ask them to wait. So, and he didn't even know them. He was that kind of a person that was quite approachable. His concept of justice was equal across the board, irrespective of status. And that is why we could discuss anything with him. And that will also mean for someone with that kind of a demeanor and status in society who remain humble to the ordinary people.
It was an amazing life he led. I mean, he came here as a teenager, I think 14 if I remember correctly, really fleeing the Nazis and the situation in Greece at the time, comes here as a refugee, doesn't actually go to school for a few years, while still growing up, and then ends up at Wits and meeting Nelson Mandela, and then in the end representing his friend and Walter Sisulu and many others at the Rivonia trial, and then spends his entire life, I mean literally the next 30, 40 years, representing people who needed help.
Yes, quite really more than those years, Steve. I think his entire life was spent in the legal fraternity. Of course, he struck that great friendship with Nelson Mandela. And as you know, how they struck the friendship was out of the teeth. But it was a beautiful one that they became lifelong friends. In fact, he writes that this was one of his longest friends, possibly after his mother and later his wife. But I think what he did as he struck the friendship across racial lines, and without being tempted to join this organization, for instance, I think this has been one of the things we once asked Comrade Brian Banton, why such people were not recruited into the party, for instance. Then he laughed about it. He said, no, it was not his task to bring them on board. And I think on this one of George Bezos, when we asked him specifically, he said we should have asked Van Fisher why he couldn't draw him in, because they also worked together and he also represented him. So his approach from his experience when he came here with his family as a young boy, and I mean, if you read his book and he explains the difficulties at that time, also made him a committed internationalist in the fight for human rights across the world. And we continue to have worked with him. I also know that he has worked very closely also with the Greek community, including with some of our comrades in Greece. Comrade Harris Dos Mentos, who wrote the book about Dimitris Apendas. When he came here, he spent a lot of time with George Bezos, and sometimes he would sleep over at the old man's place, the good friend of mine. So he also comes and spend time with me, but he spent more time with the old man, largely because of the history that the old man will share with him, and also which somewhere reflected in the book on Dimitris Apendas. And I think he also felt that somehow we were not taking up our history properly as a democratic government to reflect the contributions of all different communities into the liberation struggle of our country. And I think also the issue of how we've not taken care of Dimitris Apendas really troubled him, and he offered his assistance throughout, and legal opinion which he did freely to the mentors when he was writing the book. But generally, he was that also generous person with his legal ideas as well.
Mr. Mapaila, just while we have you, and you do represent the South African Communist Party, I would like to ask you about the news today that an agreement has been reached between Unilever South Africa, the makers of the Tresemme hair products, and the economic freedom fighters. Under the terms of the agreement, the EFF, it seems, will stop their protests outside the Click stores that we've seen over the last few days, quite difficult protests, if I can use that word. Tresemme will remove its products from all shelves, as I understand it, across the country for 10 days and make a donation of sanitary pads and sanitizers to informal settlements. All of this was sparked by this racist advert. As the South African Communist Party, how do you see what's played out over the last few days? Many people are disturbed, I think, for many, many reasons around all of this. And of course, in the middle of this is the racist advert.
Well, firstly, we reject any forms of racism, no matter how it is couched as the South African Communist Party, as you know. We're officially the first non-racial organization in South Africa, and we continue to champion non-racial South Africa. But we condemn any forms of violence, but equally understand that without practical action, many institutions are not able to respond to normal demands. For instance, if the EFF just wrote a memorandum, they would have just simply ignored it. But when they spread into action, which we want to commend their mobilization in this regard, except for the violence that was associated with it, and the outcomes that has been reached, we think that finally the organization Unilever should transform broadly, not just with the aspect about clicks. And I think that also calls for corporate South Africa that must embrace the new diversity that is taking place in our country, which they can't continue to benefit without embracing the majority